Tanze, Kisha Supernant Zikatson, Amiskuti Wiskaiganutinia, Limachifnia. Hello, I'm Dr. Kisha Supernant. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology here at the University of Alberta. I'm here today to talk a little bit about how we use different forms of remote sensing and archaeological techniques to support Indigenous communities in finding the graves of their relatives who never came home from Indian residential schools. The search for Indigenous children who died or went missing from Indian residential schools is a very complex process. It involves many different steps and must always be community-led and community-driven. There are some very important foundational things that need to be done prior to bringing in any remote sensing technologies or any outside experts, and that's bringing folks together within the community, especially survivors and their families, to talk about the process and to make sure that everyone's aware of what is happening. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on some specific technologies that archaeologists have been using for a number of years that help to find specific locations where there may be graves of children around residential school landscapes. And I'll be focusing specifically on how we map the area around Indian residential school sites and how we use various forms of technologies to look below the surface, including aerial remote sensing and near-surface geophysical techniques. The first thing I want to emphasize is that even when we have the best technologies available, it is challenging to find specific grave locations for a variety of reasons. It matters how individuals were buried. Were they buried in a formal graveyard, which we sometimes see at Indian residential school sites, or are they more clandestine grave contexts, things designed to be hidden? Knowing how people were buried matters in whether or not we're able to actually use these technologies to detect their possible resting places. Different burial practices in terms of was there a coffin or casket used, or were individuals wrapped in a shroud, also matter for whether or not we're able to detect possible graves. How graves are oriented may also differ in different contexts. We look for consistency in orientation in a formal burial ground, but in more informal contexts there may be variation, and that does additionally make things a bit challenging. Whether or not the grave is preserved also varies depending on the environment, the history of the land, and how individuals were originally interred into the ground. Around many Indian residential school landscapes, there has been development and other impacts, which may also make it challenging to detect any possible graves. I also want to note that this is a very emotionally sensitive and difficult topic, and I want to encourage anyone who may be watching to do what is needed to take care of yourself in this very difficult conversation. And some of the things I will continue talking about here will specifically deal with the locations of graves of children. And within communities, this work is also very sensitive, requiring ceremony and protocol to be followed and to be community-led. I want to talk about two different types of technologies that we use to map and understand landscapes around in Indian residential schools, as well as look below the surface of the ground. I'm going to begin with aerial techniques. These are methods used to explore the surface of the ground from the air. This can be from satellites, this can be from airplanes, this can be from unmanned aerial vehicles, also known as drones. And each of these can provide information around what might have been happening at the landscape. I'm going to talk about the use of these different technologies around detecting unmarked graves and what they can provide for work around Indian residential schools. The first type of imagery I want to discuss is various forms of photography that can be taken either from satellites, from airplanes, or from drones. This example that I have on the screen here for you is actually from an unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone, and is a technique used to map the possible location of graves in a historic cemetery context. This is not a cemetery associated with an Indian residential school, but it is a cemetery from a similar time period and likely would have some similarities with possible cemeteries around Indian residential schools. What this shows is different areas that can be detected from the drone that show either mounding or depressions that indicate possible locations of graves within the cemetery. So this is one form of technology that can be used to potentially map an area. It does require that the area be relatively clear. There would be no sort of overgrowth of forest or bush, and the ground surface is easily seen from the actual photography itself. There are some other options which work in areas that might have more wood cover or bush, and that includes LiDAR, which is a form of mapping of the surface of the ground. It creates a very detailed picture of the surface and can be used to take away any trees or bush that is overgrown over a particular site to look again for those mounds and depressions associated with potential graves. Another option when you have a lot of growth of vegetation is something called multispectral imaging. So multispectral imaging takes a photograph with multiple different wavelengths of light. And those wavelengths of light will reflect differently off different types of vegetation. That means if there's an area where humans have been doing a particular type of activity, like you see on the slide here, this is a Métis cabin site, it changes the composition of the soil, and the actual plants grow differently because of those changes in composition. And this particular camera sometimes is able to detect those differences. This could be used for graves, where if a grave is dug, it will change the composition of the soil and the vegetation might grow differently over a grave than in another part of the same area, and therefore could be used to map what's happening on the surface that can tell us something about what's happening in the graves. So these are a few of the different techniques that can be used from the air. There are some benefits to these methods, including that they tend to cover large areas very quickly. Some information has already been collected around different landscapes. LiDAR, for example, is often available at different resolutions that might be able to help as an initial way to look for graves. You can cover large areas, so you're not as limited to ground-based methods, which take time in order to cover those larger areas. It is a really good first step once the landscape around an Indian residential school has been identified as being of interest, to then narrow down places to do more concentrated ground-based methods. And it can also be used in areas where there is overgrowth, where there's wood or bush that has overgrown particular areas. It allows us to see through that to the surface of the ground itself. However, all of the techniques that I've talked about so far don't actually look below the ground surface. They only map the surface itself, which can sometimes give us indications of what's happening below, but can't necessarily show us everything we need to know about that underground patterns. Also, it hasn't been as well proven to locate unmarked graves. The methods that we know work best are ones that involve ground-based near-surface geophysics. So ground-based forms of remote sensing, also known as different forms of near-surface geophysics, include ground-penetrating radar, which I will discuss in more depth. Also, different forms of magnetometry, which measure differences in the magnetic field below the Earth's surface that can give us some indication of what might be happening. And then conductivity and resistivity, which both involve sending electrical currents through the ground and measuring the different ways in which the ground either conducts or resists electrical currents. All of these have applications in the search for unmarked graves. The most common and most well-established method for detecting unmarked graves is ground-penetrating radar. Radar technology has been around for a long time, and it started to be applied in these ground-based ways in the 1970s. It was originally designed to find buried infrastructure, pipes, and other forms of things below the surface, primarily used in engineering and development and things like this. It sends an electromagnetic wave down below the surface of the ground to scan what is below and measures how different things below that surface reflect back. So what we're really looking at is the reflections from this wave and then using them to map the subsurface. We then can interpret those reflections to be different sorts of buried objects or what we call anomalies. So things that don't look the same as the surrounding soil. We can get good information about the depth, the size, and the general characteristics of these anomalies. But I want to emphasize this is not an X-ray. We don't see the details of what is below the ground. We really just see patterns. Then we can interpret to be certain types of things. Ground-penetrating radar data comes in sort of a slice view, which is looking from the surface down and showing us the different places that things are reflected. We can look at these slices and start to map out some potential patterns. So we can collect the data, then we can start to visualize what it is we think we're seeing. In the example in front of you, we're seeing a form of pit here, where we're getting the differences in the soil where that pit was dug are reflecting back to the ground-penetrating radar unit differently than the surrounding soil. We are able to look at this map approximately the depth of this pit in its general size and shape, and then we're able to try to interpret what it is that we think that we're seeing. And when we see the right sort of size, shape, and depth to indicate a likely grave, this is how we go from those data that we presented to the interpretation of a likely grave. I will emphasize we can never be 100% certain that what we're seeing is a grave. We can be more or less confident depending on whether it's in a formal cemetery, whether there's certain patterns within the data, but it doesn't show us bodies, it doesn't show us bones. Really, this shows us any kind of grave shaft that might be present. And we do have enough knowledge now to be able to say what the difference between, say, a grave shaft and a buried rock or a pipeline. These all have very different signatures on the ground penetrating radar signals that we get. There are a lot of benefits to ground penetrating radar because it is able to detect these different shapes below the surface of the ground. It doesn't always tell us the details, but in some cases we can detect, for example, a casket or coffin, because the wood will look different than the pit, and we're able to see that pattern within the shaft. That really builds our confidence that what we're seeing here is a grave. However, ground penetrating radar, the unit must sit on the ground surface itself. So if you're in an area that is wooded, if you're in an area that has a lot of brush, you're not going to get a good signal with the GPR until that area is cleared. And in some cases, it might be possible to clear that area, and other cases, it may be more difficult. It also does not work in all environments. I really strongly recommend that any of these techniques be tested before they're applied to a possible residential school, a burial ground, because we need to know how well they work. In some environments, such as environments with a lot of clay, it provides a challenge for us to use the technology to detect unmarked graves. So before any formal survey takes place, it is best to test and see how well the actual technology works. And of course, as I mentioned, but want to reiterate, we can never be 100% sure. We can certainly be pretty sure. Sometimes we can be very, very sure if we see and detect those coffin signatures, for example, or if there's a clear row pattern within the data. But usually further investigation is needed to 100% confirm that what we're seeing is a grave. We map anomalies, we map these shapes in the ground. One of the ways to do further investigation is to add additional forms of near-surface geophysical techniques. These might include magnetic radiometry, which tells the difference between the magnetic field underneath the surface and the Earth's magnetic field. It can indicate metal objects, it can sometimes indicate areas of burning, things like this. So if there's metallic objects in a grave or on a coffin, this technique may be helpful. Another option might be conductivity or resistivity, which, as I mentioned, involves electrical currents being sent through the ground and detecting differences in how the Earth conducts or resists electricity. And this has been applied in some grave contexts with some success. Not as well established as ground penetrating radar, but certainly an option to explore, especially in environments where ground penetrating radar may not work. Overall, there are a lot of benefits to near-surface geophysics, these ground-based methods. There's an extensive body of literature now and examples from formal cemeteries that we know ground-penetrating radar works. It is an established method for finding graves. These techniques give you more specific information about what's happening below the surface, and that can provide locations on the ground where graves are likely to be present. And it also gives us a capacity to add these methods to additional data from the aerial methods discussed earlier, or adding different types of geophysical techniques together to build a picture of what's happening below the subsurface. These methods take time. Ground penetrating radar is quite labor intensive. The methods that we use to find graves, which require certain types of survey design, we like to use 25 centimeter spacing of lines in a grid. We want to go in one direction only. This means this takes quite a lot of time. On a good day, in good conditions, we might be able to cover a 30 by 30 meter or 40 by 40 meter area. And that's a very small area when we're looking at these vast landscapes, often associated with Indian residential schools. So as much information as we can get from the historical record, from land use, to really target ground penetrating radar and other geophysical techniques, the better the results from these techniques will be. And there are situations where this may not work and may not be the appropriate method to use to find unmarked graves. And the reality also that we're facing is that there are some graves that probably are forever lost because of the history of what's happened around these sites since the Indian residential schools were no longer in operation. So this can be helpful, but may not be able to find everything that we're looking for. Overall, I think there is a lot of benefit to using aerial remote sensing and geophysical techniques to help map out where graves might be associated with Indian residential schools. But we need to follow consistent best practices. Not everyone who knows how to use a ground penetrating radar unit has the techniques to actually use that to find unmarked grave locations. Remote sensing is not the first step in helping to find the children, nor is it the last. It's something that benefits from having a lot of engagement, bringing together information from the historical record, from the knowledge of survivors and the community, and from what we know about what happened to the land since the Indian residential school was no longer in use, before we even consider bringing in some of these techniques. Again, re-emphasizing this is a specific application of this technology and needs to follow a consistent method. There's not that many people in the lands we call Canada who actually have experience doing this work. And we are trying to develop shared resources, including through the Canadian Archaeological Association Working Group, to be able to have a consistent application of best practices across these many different places where we know children's graves are likely to be. And overall, just to step back out and to conclude this video, this is a very difficult process. Having spent a number of years working with communities to find unmarked graves, it is always very tragic and heartbreaking for those doing the work, and especially for the communities whose relatives and loved ones may be buried in these graves. Communities must lead this process. They must determine what is the best path forward for the survivors in any given school and bring in the expertise when appropriate. Ceremony and protocol are a very important part of this work. Something that I do in my own practice when I'm using these techniques is to conduct ceremony as we're actually doing it, because it is such sensitive work. The most important source of information for us when we're planning to do a survey using any of the techniques I talked about today is community knowledge. There's always experiences of survivors, of other folks in the community who've seen or heard or experienced things that help us to narrow down where we should be looking for possible unmarked graves of children. It is important to clarify that there's certain things we can't know using ground penetrating radar. We can, indicate anomalies, probable grave locations. We might be able to map certain types of landscapes, but we can't provide all the answers with these techniques. We do our best to provide results quickly because we know how important it is, but it's also important that we're not overstating our results and taking the time to interpret those results, for example, from ground penetrating radar, so we're not providing inaccurate information for communities. And fundamentally, the information that we gather in this process belongs to communities. We must uphold data sovereignty in this work and ensuring that this is not a research project. This is not something that I take the information and publish an academic article on. This is very much work on behalf of the community, and whatever they choose to do with the information we provide needs to stay in their hands. Overall, this is going to be a long process to find all the different locations where children may have been buried who never came home from Indian residential schools. But there's a lot of work that has already been done that can help to guide how communities approach this very challenging issue. Hi, and thank you for listening.